What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my review after 100% for Doom: The Dark Ages. The next installment in the long-running Doom franchise, of course, this time bringing a sort of medieval spin on it as a prequel to Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal. Before we get into all that, to get my usual stuff out of the way, I review games after 100% all the time to set me apart from other reviewers on the platform, and while that does include the achievements, it also includes a lot more than that. There's a link below covering everything I go over, and my Steam profile is public and linked below as well. But with that in mind, a couple more things to note. Obviously, this is going live ahead of the game's early access period, even if you bought the deluxe edition or whatever, which is of course possible because I was provided a review key by Xbox, and what's more, I actually attended a preview event for it back in March. So there's all that for you. Now, in the case of Doom in the Dark Ages, when it comes to 100% on this, a couple things to note. One of the achievements is actually bugged, at least on Steam specifically, because in the game itself, you can actually access the sort of milestone system, which shows all of your accomplishments, which is mostly just the achievement list, but there are actually a few extra on there. And through this milestone list, I confirmed that I did, in fact, complete the Berserker achievement, mind you, but it never popped on Steam, so I assume there's some sort of issue with how those two are communicating, so definitely wanted to mention that, but obviously it's not going to hold up a review. What's more, while the achievement list is pretty thorough in terms of covering all the content and grabbing all the collectibles, which is the bulk of them, the in-game milestone system does have a few extra things that the achievements do not cover, specifically beating the game on the higher difficulties. In fact, for beating the game on its highest difficulty, Ultra Nightmare, you get the Conqueror skin, which is this gold skin for your character that you can use in subsequent playthroughs. Now, obviously you can see on screen here that I've unlocked it, but that's not as difficult as it might initially seem for reasons we'll get into in the difficulty section. Because for now, let's first talk about what this game is. So obviously, prequel to the more recent Doom titles, this time with that more medieval spin, specifically because we are playing through some of the Doom Slayer's time with the Night Sentinels, as we rip and tear our way through the classic hordes of demons. But I don't want to go into that too much, simply because obviously we're ahead of release here and I don't want to spoil the campaign for people, and to that end, I'm not going to show much beyond the few opening cinematics for the first few levels, but what I am going to show is a few of the later levels past those, just to kind of show you what's available variety-wise, but I wanted to mention that because obviously I don't want to do spoilers, and there may well be some contextual stuff in the footage that you may or may not consider a spoiler, so, be advised, frankly. But with this change in timeline, as far as the modern two games go, it's also worth a mention that it comes with a bit of a shift in philosophy as well, with this game aiming to capture the sort of flow of the original games while adapting a stand and fight philosophy. Meaning that just because you're going toe-to-toe with a particularly large demon doesn't necessarily mean that what you want to do is run and gun or just back up and shoot, that kind of stuff, because very often your best bet, thanks to a few of the mechanics we'll talk about later in the video, is usually to just actually stand there and go blow for blow with these characters, trading melee hits and trying to parry and block and everything else. And while that part is pretty fun in combination with the larger open levels that allow you to do a lot of exploring, it does have a slight issue here and there, my biggest one by far being that a lot of emphasis was put on the Atlan mechs, and that you were finally able to pilot one, and that they're sort of dropping of multiplayer allowed for that and things like the Cyber Dragon to be added. And yet, in having played this game, I've got to say that the Atlan mech missions in particular are kind of underwhelming. It's basically just a punch combo system as you walk through what is essentially a linear corridor, fighting some Titan demons as you go, and that's kind of just it. It never evolves, never changes over the entire course of the game, and while it's cool the first time, it gets stale pretty much immediately afterwards. So frankly, there's some good and some bad, as you would expect with basically everything. But before we dive too deep, let's then talk about the technical state of this game. So quite a few things to mention here, but let's start with the problematic stuff. So in addition to the review key that they sent over, they did give me access to a pre-release NVIDIA driver that was used for the game, obviously. So that's a thing with review keys where sometimes they are making those for drivers that have not yet been released publicly, and so they made that driver available to me and I was using that. So just as a mention, do remember to update your drivers for this game because you might have problems otherwise. But beyond that, there's two things I want to mention. The game did crash on me one time over the course of about 30 or so hours, But perhaps the slightly more annoying issue is that sometimes whatever objective you are currently on in your current mission can sometimes sort of stall out, and for whatever reason, like a door in a linear corridor might not open or something like that, and you're forced to reload to a checkpoint in order to fix that, which to be fair does usually fix it. But on the other difficulties, Pandemonium and Ultra Nightmare, where if you want to reload you have to just restart the level you are currently on, that can be incredibly frustrating, which did happen twice. Now the other technical stuff I want to mention is equally important, but mostly just for the sake of knowing, and this is the fact that Doom the Dark Ages does require a ray tracing graphics card, which basically means a 20 series or higher. And while I can appreciate that might be an annoyance for some people, in fairness to basically every developer, at some point they're going to have to drop support for the roughly 10-year-old 1000 series cards, but given the pricing of the new stuff, it's no small wonder that people are clinging to older GPUs. What's more though, the game does feature a host of accessibility options, all sorts of stuff. You can change all the color coding that you're going to see, and like we have seen up to this point in the video. You can change colors on things like all the parry indicators and basically anything else you see on screen. You can adjust a lot of that stuff. I think they did a pretty good job with the accessibility options here, so just bear that in mind as you watch some of the footage. Next up, let's talk about difficulty. So when you fire up Doom the Dark Ages and start a brand new campaign, you're going to be met with a list of preset difficulties followed by the modifiers. Now, the presets include Aspiring Slayer through Nightmare for the sort of base difficulties, and then Pandemonium and Ultra Nightmare could largely be considered a slightly separate thing. This is because Aspiring Slayer through Nightmare can basically be sort of fully customized via the modifiers, whereas Pandemonium and Ultra Nightmare have some things that you cannot adjust via the modifiers. Specifically, Pandemonium and Ultra Nightmare are essentially Iron Man modes, with the difference being that in Pandemonium, it's Nightmare by default, and then you can, if you have life sigils, which are effectively like revives, when you die, you can go ahead and restart the chapter. Whereas in Ultra Nightmare, if you die, the campaign ends and the life sigils you normally would be picking up only act as a health pickup instead. But this next page is difficulty modifiers. So this stuff is available pretty much regardless of what difficulty preset you picked. So outside of some stuff behind the scenes that is always the case, you can fundamentally change and alter whatever you'd like to your heart's content, and this is why beating Ultra Nightmare is not as daunting as it might initially seem, because while it is a sort of preset, you can go in here and alter very specific aspects of it to make it as easy or even as more difficult as you would prefer. And so how difficult or easy this game is largely comes down to you, the player, though personally, as a big fan of modular difficulties, I do think this is the right way to go. But I am fully aware other people have their own thoughts on the matter. Next up, though, we have the story setup and my thoughts on it. So as I've already mentioned, we are playing through some of the Slayer's time with the Night Sentinels, and I don't want to get too into the specifics to avoid spoilers here, but I am going to go over the sort of basic setup. The Slayer is being used by the makers to, of course, confront an ongoing war with the demons and specifically to combat some of their invasions, with the demons largely targeting energy sources in this particular section of the galaxy. And as you begin fighting off these invasions, it becomes quickly apparent that a lot of these demons are being led at the direction of a sort of adversary that you'll come toe-to-toe with over the course of the game, which is going to see you slaughtering your way through realms both known and unknown. Now, I don't really want to say more than that at this time, again, simply for the sake of spoilers, but I will say that there was some stuff at the end that caught me a bit off guard that I thought was particularly interesting, and by and large, I enjoyed the story quite a bit. With it taking place over 22 chapters, a couple of those being Atlan and sort of dragon-related missions, I really enjoyed the dragon missions. We'll talk a bit more about this in the gameplay section, but as I've already mentioned, the Atlan missions in particular felt a little underwhelming, though. Moving on to our progression systems, however. As we make our way through the game's various levels, we're going to be picking up all sorts of stuff, various currencies, items we can use for upgrades. We're also going to be picking up new weapons, ripping essences straight from demons, and hopefully completing some mastery challenges when you fully upgrade a weapon. So let's start with the basic one, the weapons. You come into all of these at set moments in time as you progress through the campaign. You can't really miss them. They're all going to be directly put in your path as part of the main story, and ultimately there is 12 of them. Most of them are divided into classes, that is to say a type of weapon that uses a particular bit of ammo, such as the shell class with the shotguns, or the spike class, or the plasma class, that kind of thing. So for instance, we get a combat shotgun and then the super shotgun. We get a regular plasma gun or a sort of twin-barreled version of that same plasma gun as a couple examples. Now, it's not so much that any of these is really better than the other, but rather that they simply function differently, and you can swap between whichever weapon that you want, mind you, as you do have all 12 of them with you, but generally they're divided into class, which share an ammo type, and then you'll sort of hot swap between them as you go. Now, each of these weapons can be upgraded with the various currencies: gold, rubies, and wraith stones. So the initial upgrades are typically gold, the middle ones are rubies, and then the final one is the wraith stone. Once you've completely maxed out a weapon, though, you'll then unlock its mastery challenge, usually some objective involving slaughtering demons with whatever that upgrade gave you as you made the weapon better. So for instance, the plasma guns start shocking enemies, and you have to hit so many enemies with that damage type, or the grenade launcher has secondary cluster bombs that will drop with its upgrade, and you have to damage enemies with those cluster bombs, as a couple examples. Now, the reward for completing the mastery challenges is, in fact, the golden skin for that weapon. Secondary to your regular weapons is your shield and your melee weapons. So your shield starts as a basic shield that you'll simply be able to parry with, but I believe it's the second mission, so very early on you get access to the shield saw, allowing you to throw your shield, which allows you to shatter superheated metal, which is one of the big gameplay elements both in combat and traversal. Now, when it comes to upgrading your shield, you can upgrade the base of it, and then also runes that you'll pick up in some of the later bits of the game. So runes cause your parry of Hell Surge, or the things you can actually parry, that is, at least most of the time. Some of them are just regular attacks, but Hell Surge attacks, when you parry them, will trigger your runes that you are currently using on your shield, and this will produce extra effects, like ground fissures, an auto turret to activate, a stunning holy bolt, all that stuff. So each of those individual runes can also be upgraded, and this uses the same currency as the other stuff, as do the melee weapons. Melee weapons there are just 3 of, but it's your basic power gauntlet, the flail, and then the dread mace. The dread mace I didn't really enjoy. It's only got 1 charge, and it's real slow to activate, which just didn't feel good to me. The gauntlet and the flail are pretty good. You could just kind of choose whichever one you want to use there. But given that the game is called The Dark Ages, I think the correct answer is the flail. Another thing you'll be upgrading along the way, though, is simply your health and base armor. So this is essentially done by just killing enemy leaders, which will then see you ripping out their essence and using it to empower yourself, which of course increases the associated stat. This is health armor mostly, and then you can also increase the ammo capacity for the various ammo types as you do this as well. The vast majority of these essence upgrades are along the critical path, that is to say stuff that you can't really miss, with only like 1 or 2 of the health and armor upgrades being off the critical path. What you see much more in the optional encounters with these leaders is the ammo type upgrades, just as a bit of an aside. But that's pretty much it as far as progression systems go, so let's move on to the gameplay and world. As I mentioned briefly earlier, the game takes place across 22 different chapters. These chapters can largely be divided up into a few different types. Your sort of traditional Doom levels, your more open-ended levels, and then the Dragon and Atlan missions. Now, the Dragon ones are a little more complicated because the Dragon missions typically just see you occasionally riding the dragon while also getting off on foot and exploring various places as well. So the Dragon missions are usually simply a part of other levels. The Atlan missions, though, are pretty much all about the Atlan. These are the ones I did not like. As I mentioned, it's basically just some basic punch stuff. You dodge out of the way when it's time to dodge, which gives you a temporary bonus to all of your attacks and damage. It's very easy, it's not engaging, and it's cool like one time, but after that, not so much. The Dragon, I think they did a much better job with. Mostly because, yes, you can fly around and explore with the Dragon. You can also find the occasional secret landing spot in those missions, so you can actually find some secret stuff associated with exploring with the Dragon, even though you hop off afterwards and explore on foot typically. There's also stuff to do while flying the Dragon, such as shooting at various ships that you can find, which can give you some rewards, or simply fighting the various enemies or ships you'll come across. Now, admittedly, the actual combat of these Dragon sections is also not great, as it is effectively the same thing, just a sort of time to dodge, which empowers your attacks, which allows you to burst through shields. So it's also not incredibly engaging as far as combat goes, but the rest of it is fun enough to make up for it, I think. Now, you'll be spending most of your time on foot, though, so let's talk a little bit about that. As we move through any individual level, we're obviously going to be battling our way through hordes of demons, but we'll also be collecting a lot of stuff, gold for starters, which is one of the primary resources for your upgrades, finding secret areas, which usually leads to collectibles such as toys, which you can then view from the main menu, skins for your various weapons, as well as bits of the codex giving you background lore on some of the characters you'll run into or the places you happen to be exploring, that kind of stuff. And you're going to find all of that naturally by exploring. A lot of that exploration does involve a bit of running around, particularly solving some light puzzles or doing a little bit of platforming. Now, this is not nearly as intensive, let's say, as Doom Eternal's platforming, and you do stay relatively on the ground, so to speak. But a lot of these puzzles do involve utilizing your shield, specifically your shield saw, in order to traverse individual elements, typically by throwing your shield at it. So there are bits of superheated metal throughout, both on enemies, so in combat, as well as in traversal elements. These being things like just these big metal sort of Templar cross type things you can throw your shield at to then shatter, and then that will typically, say, unhook something to give you access to like a block or whatever to push it where you need, so you can scramble your way up whatever and do a little bit of platforming as you make your way through places. So there's a little bit of that stuff, but it's not over the top or anything by any means. And thankfully, the auto map is pretty good about showing you where the various items are, which makes it pretty easy to make sure that you've fully explored a level before moving on, which makes it very possible to do all of the achievements in one run as long as you don't want the, skins and stuff from doing the harder difficulties. Now, another thing that tends to come with these missions, though, once you get to a certain point, is actually mission challenges. These typically involve performing some task, usually killing demons in a certain way, but also occasionally finding some optional stuff, such as, for example, in the big siege mission, taking out various bits of artillery that are scattered throughout, and the reward for completing these challenges, usually the same stuff, like skins or extra gold for your upgrades, that kind of stuff, just to give you a little bit more direction to your wandering. Now, naturally, all of that is sort of broken up then by the combat that you'll be having as you do pretty much all of that, though you do get the occasional sort of moment to breathe, which helps you puzzle out like where to go or how to find individual secrets, that kind of stuff. So it's not like a non-stop onslaught or anything, you do have the occasional moment to breathe. But I did want to mention before we transition to combat here, simply that I liked the sort of mix of missions here. Outside of the Atlan stuff being a little disappointing, I enjoyed going from missions that were a little more on rails to then getting missions that were opened up and more freeform exploration where you could sort of pick and choose whether to just follow the actual main objective or fully explore the level in a proper completionist type approach, which I really enjoyed, obviously. And it was just really fun to run through a lot of these levels, especially some of the ones in the later parts of the game that do some interesting stuff that I'll be curious to see how people react to be honest. Now, as we move into the combat section, I want to start this by saying that if you've watched the channel at all, really, the main thing I'm known for is covering big RPGs. I typically play and review these games as a break from all the big RPGs, and one of the things you'll hear me say is that sometimes it's fun to just shoot stuff, and while that remains true, that is in large part why I like to play these games every once in a while, I do think in the case of Doom the Dark Ages, that statement could be a little bit of a reduction of what's going on here. In fact, I think the combat here, now that I've experienced the full game, has a lot of different mechanics, and it really clicked with me in a big way. Like, I kind of just got it. And while I'm not claiming to be a savant or anything, and I'm sure there will be a million people much better at this than I am, one thing that is really fun about these types of games is that there tends to be a moment where you're just like, oh, I get it. And you suddenly find yourself trying to pick the most efficient way to destroy all of these various hordes of demons. In particular, though, I started my first playthrough on normal, which is what I usually do for most games, and then I'll up the difficulty as required for later playthroughs if they are required, that kind of thing, and then see where it goes from there. But in the case of Doom the Dark Ages, about halfway through the game, I kind of realized that even on normal, I was just destroying everything. So I went ahead and messed around with the difficulty modifiers to then, of course, make the game more difficult. And that experience is actually what led me to being like, oh, I could definitely do that Ultra Nightmare, I think. As my initial plan going into this was just going to be like, if it was too difficult, or I just couldn't quite manage it to just put out a regular review since this is a little outside my normal genre anyway, plus all the difficulty modifiers they let you deal with. I was more than happy to just let this one be whatever it was going to be. But then, as I mentioned, it just sort of clicked, and I found myself having a ton of fun with this, to the point of actively looking for a greater challenge. Now, I wanted to start the combat section by mentioning that because obviously the combat here is a pretty big shift from 2016 and Eternal. I am not as familiar with those games, and honestly I don't even need to be to tell you that change is never universally liked, and people that liked the combat in those games a great deal might not like the change in approach here, or vice versa, you know? Happens all the time. So I'm well aware opinions on this will be split to some degree. But for example, I've played a lot of games where parrying was a really big mechanic, so having to do that here effectively with your shield, with a parry window that is by default much more generous than basically any Souls-like, that was not a significant deal to me. And if anything, I kind of felt right at home doing that because I play a lot of games where that's a requirement. And then from there, it was just a matter of sort of cycling through which weapons would be the best for any given situation. For instance, if you're fighting enemies with shields, you want to, as quickly as possible, superheat them, throw the shield at them. If they have plasma shields, you want to use a plasma weapon to overload those shields, which then produces an AoE. You can also use your shield saw to throw it directly into a larger enemy, effectively stunning them and taking them out of the fight for a second, provided they don't have armor. A lot of armor can be smashed to bits by the flail, as an example. Other types of weapons have various effectiveness against types of armor as you try to superheat it to throw your shield in it to destroy it more quickly. And there's basically just all of these sort of little micro decisions you have to make as you work your way through any given combat encounter. And that is the part that I really, really enjoyed about it, and why I said much earlier that I think it's a bit of a reduction to simply call it just shooting things, which to be fair is true of most first-person shooter titles. It just really bears an explanation here. But let's dig in a little more on the melee system in particular. So obviously there's a parry mechanic, but you can also just activate your melee attack. This is typically done via melee charges. Both the gauntlet and the mace have 3 base charges each. I believe it's the mace can actually get 4 charges if you successfully parry as you are going back and forth, so you can get a bigger combo there. But as you parry in general, you can instantly get back melee charges to keep going toe-to-toe with an enemy. Now every time you melee an enemy, they're going to typically drop like health and armor, which is going to keep you from dying as you go toe-to-toe with an enemy, in addition to simply parrying their attack. Now where this gets tricky though is that while you can stand toe-to-toe with an enemy, the other enemies don't just like stop while this is going around, meaning that you will actively be attacked by everybody else around you at the same time, which means you need to not only be aware of the enemy that you are standing and fighting against, but also everything else around you. And that, combined with the sort of melee aspect of the shield and the ability to shield charge and use it to stun enemies to create distance, that kind of thing, means that a lot of combat to me, while obviously having a bit of a melee focus, is really all about creating distance and closing distance as you need to, in order to sort of maintain control of everything that is happening around you, which is then itself a sort of byproduct of the combat that the game itself takes advantage of later on. For instance, there's an enemy that in the later stages of the game will actually throw up a shield if you get too far away from it, becoming immune to damage, and it only drops that shield when you get close enough for it to melee attack you, at which point it starts swinging pretty mercilessly. And while that might sound annoying, it's really not as bad as it seems, because you can actually just create some distance, force that thing to shield up, at which point it does some basic projectile attacks that are easy enough to dodge, so you can clear out the other enemies around it before focusing on this thing with its wild melee swings that are difficult to deal with on top of other enemies swarming you, as an example. Now, some other things to be aware of, again, the superheated metal. Some enemies have armor, typically the bigger enemies. You're going to have to punch through that armor. There are certain weapons that just deal better damage to armor generally, and then when it gets superheated, if you keep attacking it, it will eventually break, but the easiest thing to do is just throw the shield at it to break it faster. Probably worth a mention that the glory kills aren't nearly as much of a thing here. That does happen occasionally, so when you deal enough damage to typically the bigger enemies who have the health for it, they can occasionally become dazed, at which point you can sort of strike them, which typically disables a weapon or so at first, but then once they get closer to death, it's like a sort of proper glory kill that isn't quite as prevalent as it was in the previous games because of the melee system, which already allows you to sort of get a breather via these parries and attacks. Also worth a mention that those melee attacks typically replenish your ammo for every weapon as opposed to simply having to find pickups, which gives you yet another reason to sort of have a little back and forth with closing the distance and then creating that distance when you want to use your weapons. But with all of that said, the rest of it is stuff you've probably seen on screen up to this point. It's really just about learning the best practices for any individual situation. Like the basic fodder demons, there's really no point in wasting ammo on them. A shield throw will kill them all immediately, so will a shield charge as long as they don't have a literal shield that you need to punch through, which I've already discussed how to deal with. The bigger demons usually aren't a huge deal, outside of simply learning how to minimize the damage they deal to you so you can deal with them as quickly as possible. With a lot of the challenge that comes up in the later levels being just the variety of waves of these guys that get thrown at you and the different combinations therein and what you have access to everything around you. But if all else fails, you can pull out the BFC this time around and clear some things out very, very quickly. But if I were to sum up combat a little more succinctly, I had a blast with it. I think you can create exactly the level of challenge you're comfortable with all of the modifiers and everything. I think it's pretty plain to see that a lot of effort went into designing the individual combat encounters and then just how things like the melee system plays out, which I wound up enjoying a lot more than I thought. And like I said towards the beginning of this section, something about this system just really clicked with me and I kind of just got it, which made for a really, really enjoyable time. Finally, moving on a bit though, let's then talk about the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is a hard no on this one. That is largely because the GPU it has is not really compatible with what this game pulls. As an example, the Steam Deck has roughly a comparable 10 series card, and while yes, it can technically do ray tracing, I just literally could not get this game to work on the Steam Deck. The second I would load it up, it just immediately crashed every time. So, never say never, I guess, but as it stands, I couldn't get this to work on the Steam Deck literally at all, so wouldn't expect to have a good time there, but I guess we'll see what happens in the future. Which brings us to positives, negatives, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So, on the positive side of things, we obviously have the combat. All of the various modular difficulty options that go in there. I honestly thought the story was pretty good. I enjoyed the exploration. I enjoyed the very medieval vibe of it, which, if you tell by the games I play, is something I enjoy frequently anyway. So perhaps unsurprisingly, the main focus of what this game is trying to do and be about is what it excels at. But there are nonetheless some negatives. So primarily, just straight away, the Atlan missions. I don't think they're very fun. I think it was novel literally the very first time I did it, and every subsequent time it was just an incredibly boring slog. And to be honest, it's kind of odd to me that they hyped those up as a sort of thing they were able to add because they dropped stuff like multiplayer, but then those Atlan missions aren't anything special at all. They're very basic, especially when compared to the Dragon missions that they added for what I believe was the same reasons. And those by comparison are a lot more fleshed out and there's more to do and it's just more enjoyable overall as a mechanic. So I guess I'm just confused what the hype there was. But the other negative, this is the kind of game that could use some sort of side challenge mode or even just like an arena or something to keep the challenge going. And I know Eternal eventually got things like master levels as an example, but here the only thing you can really do is just replay chapters you've already completed as an example, and that's fine. It just really feels like this game could use some sort of extra side mode to allow you to just do some other stuff. Like speaking for myself, I think an endless horde mode would be super fun here, but as it stands, that's not really an option. And then for a last negative, I deliberately tried not to show much of this, but frankly, a lot of the boss fights are a little underwhelming. There's a couple right towards the end that I thought were better done and more interesting, just because they're a little more involved, but basically every boss fight up to that point felt like barely a bump in the road, and I feel like they could have done a better job there with the sort of grandiosity of those encounters. But for me at least, what I enjoyed of playing through the actual levels themselves made up for it, so it wasn't a huge deal at the end of the day. Which then brings me to my conclusion. So, Doom the Dark Ages is $70 US over on Steam. It's also going to be day one on Game Pass, I believe. And for that, you're getting a game with really fantastic combat as far as I'm concerned, but I imagine other people will have different opinions on that subject. Cool levels to explore, challenges to complete, and a pretty interesting story that I enjoyed seeing all the way through. But when it comes to recommending it, I would say it's largely going to come down to how much you enjoy this particular iteration of the combat, with the rest being minor quibbles in comparison. So, Given how much I had fun with this, obviously it gets a buy out of me, but, again, if $70 is a bit too steep for a game that took me, 30-ish hours to 100%, Game Pass then seems the likely option, which is probably going to continue to be the case for the foreseeable future, with Xbox having recently announced an increase to their prices up to that $80 base, which is an unfortunate but not really unexpected move. As far as this video goes, though, that's pretty much going to wrap it up, so hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. Let me know how you feel about this one down in the comment section below, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.